And welcome back to episode 3 of our podcast series on portfolios and making them lean. In the last two episodes, we've had some great conversations about what we mean by portfolio, our histories, and then moving into some nuances and some considerations of the elements of a portfolio. And in doing that, we foreshadowed a little bit that you need to start where you are, and then that we'd be going for this big tangent in episode 3. And it's time for that. We recognize that portfolios exist for a purpose, and you can't talk about designing and evolving portfolios until you understand that purpose with nuance. And in the last episode, we talked about 3 different ways that a portfolio can engage in strategy. Two of those, frankly, you must have a deep understanding of strategy. If you're receiving a strategy, you can't fully support it without understanding what's behind it. And if you're crafting a strategy, you really need a way to put yourself in the context and in the perspective in the overall portfolio. So, therefore, in this episode, we are going to go quite deep on strategy. Now, Mark and I, for different reasons and different parts of our history, both became really big fans of Geoffrey Moore and love to geek out about his content. And we're going to use Geoffrey Moore's work as our primary lens here. There's lots of strategy models out there. Your company could use any one of the many different options or your own mismatch and local hybrid, and that's fine. But for this conversation, we're going to use what Geoffrey Moore did. We'll talk about the Three Horizons model and the originals of that and where it came from. And then we're going to really dig into his work from Zone to Win and the 4 zones, because we find that particularly relevant to thinking about how portfolios work and where they sit. Now, we're not going to drill into the specifics of how each zone maps to portfolios. We probably won't be able to avoid talking about it somewhat because we really geek out on this stuff. But in episode 4, and then more so in episode 5, we're going to cover a lot of the implications of these zones and how they match to different portfolio choices. But for this one, we're going to stay focused on the strategy layer. Mark, do you want to take an opportunity and set some context around this whole discussion around strategy?
Look, I'd love to. And, if you think about the relationship between portfolio and strategy and knowing that we're going to talk about portfolios a tiny bit and strategy an awful lot today, I think when you think about strategy as a whole, an enterprise has a strategy. And a big enough enterprise will probably have many strategies, but they've got to cohere into something. And, we touched last episode on the idea of strategy unfolding. And when you think about strategy unfolding, what would be nice would be able to say, I've got an overall enterprise strategy, and then I've got various parts of my enterprise that are responsible for different pieces of that strategy. And I could actually look at a map and go, here's the overall strategy. Here it is broken into 10 or 20 pieces. And you can see the piece of strategy that each has taken ownership of. And you can look at that map and say, we can see it all adds up to the overall intent we've got. And then I can also look at a little piece and go, hey, my piece of strategy has a lot of synergy or need for alignment with, or even potential conflict with, some of my neighbors. So, this piece of saying, how do we take an overall strategy, decompose it logically into a fashion that's recomposable but also understandable in context. And, I talk about this as partitioning strategy or unfolding strategy. Eric likes the word unpacking. And Zone to Win and Geoffrey Moore's work gives a great tool for that. Now, because a portfolio generally should be a strategic vehicle, there's an obvious correlation between the notion of unfolding strategy and unfolding or structuring your portfolios. But, we stressed last episode, and I think we'll stress again and again and again, that to start where you are as a coach, you've got to know where you are. And whether or not your enterprise's strategy has been unfolded in this way or your portfolios have been structured in this way, you should be able to look at every portfolio you've got and go, this is the role it has in the overall strategy, and this is the relationship it's got to its neighbors, i.e., its purpose is to fulfill a component of strategy. And Eric, I think you wanted to add something a little bit on the purpose front. I know it's one of your favorite words.
Yeah, it's one of those words that I find just deeply confusing in conversation because people can mean wildly different things. And in this context, your business has a reason for existing. Your portfolio therefore needs a reason for existing. It has to have a bigger picture. Why is this portfolio part of the enterprise and why is it funded at this time? And that's different than the impact. And so we talk about purpose in the sense of OKRs and what changes we're trying to make. Um, but sometimes looking back, it's like, why do we even have this big area of interest in the first place? Is a bigger purpose to pay attention to. And asking that question around portfolios requires this connection to strategy and the lenses that Mark will continue sharing here.
So if we kind of keep playing down this path of saying you're starting where you are, and yet we're actually about to completely geek out on a different way of defining decomposition of areas of strategy. I think the curiosity for us always is to say, if, and using that lean idea of look through new eyes, the notion of investment zones gives you a whole bunch of clues to go, okay, when I find something and when I clarify its purpose and how it fits into the broader whole, if I understand where it lives in terms of the nature of its orientation and purpose within the whole through an investment zone lens, then that can start to prompt me to ask particular questions. And it draws my attention to maybe areas of opportunity or perhaps areas of gap. And when we were doing our exploration for this podcast, we automatically started to talk deep zones. And then we went, hang on a second, we've lived and breathed zones for an awfully long time now, and not everybody necessarily has. So I might throw back to Eric to just kick us into the world of zones and investment horizons.
Yeah, and I think the three horizons, originally McKinsey, popularized in my mind through most of Geoffrey Moore's books over the years, is a really interesting and useful lens in and of itself. And it's just the idea that you have some set of your business, some portion of your business efforts are earning you money. Otherwise, you're not an ongoing concern. You might be a startup, you might still be pre-growth, whatever. That's not the conversation we're having here. For companies that are successful and operating in the market, you have something that is your cash cow. It is your primary source or sources of revenue. And those are what we call Horizon 1. And frankly, they're critical because that's what you rely on to pay the bills and to earn the money and pay back your stakeholders and shareholders and so on. But then we expand this and we look at two other horizons. And I actually like to talk about Horizon 3 next and then come back to the middle one. So the third horizon is those things that you believe maybe someday may be material to your business. And we talked about materiality as one of our buzzwords, and you're going to hear it time and time again today in the podcast. But the Horizon 3 are those new and emerging businesses, fairly small, not relevant to your overall business and enterprise yet, but you believe they might someday have the legs to be material, and therefore you're investing into them. And these are things, and the reason they're called Horizon 3 is they're way over the horizon. They're 5 years out. You're not going to get money from this year that's material. You probably won't get money material next year, but maybe in 3 to 5 years you start to see real impact from them. Now, to get from there, these Horizon 3 opportunities to where they're cash cows, you need to go through a transition journey. And that's what the Horizon 2 journey is. And it's this idea that you're going from potential materiality, enough proof that you think it's relevant to your business, to intentionally move to where it is kind of taking its seat at the table. It is a material Horizon 1 investment. We'll talk more about ratios later, but think of it as 10% of your overall revenue. And To get to that point is a journey, and it needs to be intentional, it needs to be time bound, and it probably represents a changing of the guard of the leadership that's involved. So that's Horizon 2. Now you'll see these in Safe. If you dig into the portfolio level in Safe, it shows up as a guardrail and a way of thinking about dividing your portfolio a little bit. And that's an interesting lens, but it's not the original lens. We're using it in this conversation completely at the overall company strategy level, not for like portfolio strategic themes or nuance of designing a portfolio. And Mark, I know you've got a ton of experience in history with Geoffrey Moore. Is there anything you wanted to add from your historical geeking out on it?
Yeah, so my introduction to the whole concept of investment horizons was Escape Velocity. It was actually the first Geoffrey Moore book I read. I mean, he's best known for Crossing the Chasm, but for some reason I started with Escape Velocity.
Me
And
too, actually.
the whole concept of Escape Velocity was how to free your company from the pull of the past. And he used escape velocity, of course, as the speed that a rocket needs to reach to escape Earth's gravity well. And he really dwelt on the tension between, the pull of Horizon One. That's where the money is. It absolutely dominates your thinking. But the fact that if you're not investing in a possible future, then you're heading for your Kodak moment, or
Mhm.
you know, pick
Whole new
a.
meaning now, isn't it?
It so is a whole new meaning. Um, and so, I saw it and I went, this is fantastic. And in actual fact, the first portfolio, like serious strategic portfolio work I did, we were playing with the investment horizons pretty heavily. But in the years since then, there've been a whole bunch of nuances added. And I think the first nuance that came along was Horizon Zero. And Horizon Zero was the decommissioning zone.
Mhm.
Uh, and, you've got serious product offerings in market, you don't decommission them for free. One of our big telcos in Australia recently, probably 2 or 3 years ago, went through a plan simplification process, and they retired a whole bunch of legacy plans, simplified their plan model, and boy, it took them a lot of money to do it, a lot of
Mhm.
effort. So we introduced Horizon Zero, and then we introduced. I talk about them as Horizon 1A and 1B. So you subdivided Horizon 1 from, this is your dominant world today, into a growth and a, you know, diminishment phase.
Cash,
I've
cash
got
cow.
a, so growth is, it's in market, product or service, and there's still growth to be had. And for me, that's always 1A. 1B is, it's really past the market peak. There's not significant growth left in the offer, but what we're looking to do is to extend the tail. Um,
So I
back to
look
you.
at that and living in a product company where that difference was critical. I mean, we had some products that lived in one and some in the other, and it was a very clear thing. Um, I think of it as chasing growth versus chasing margin,
Yeah.
as my distinction of 1A versus 1B.
Uh, my buzz phrase is extend the profitable tail of it. Right? So this kind of evolution of the horizon based thinking really came together. We saw it appear piece by piece, and obviously Safe followed those pieces as they came along. But then Moore wrote this book, which was like a bringing together of his previous 5 or 6 books called Zone to Win. I might chuck back to you here, Eric.
And honestly, I don't know that I have much I want to add around the new book other than I found it and I lit up. And it was in a time horizon when Geoffrey Moore released Zone to Win, which kind of pulled everything together. Lencioni released The Advantage, which pulled many of his works together. Um, the third one escaped me, but another one of my kind of long-term favorite authors did a similar thing. It was, in my mind, it was kind of the year when of synthesis. Like everybody kind of brought their careers together in a way that then unlocked a whole new mode of thinking, the magnum opus style, finishing everything up.
Yeah.
Um, but instead of like joyfully talking about and advocating for the book, maybe we should dig into the book and talk about the difference a little bit and talk about the zones.
So,
So go
oh,
ahead,
you
Mark.
go. All right, I'll take it. So fundamentally, uh, I think of the book as moving from how to invest to how to run your company. And we move from this thinking of horizons to a thinking of zones, and it was published as a four quadrant grid. And four zones: the transformation zone, the incubation zone, the performance zone, the productivity zone. And there was a very clear correlation to horizons, but then there are a whole bunch of implications added, right?
Mhm.
How are you governing it? How are you financing it? What do you expect your focus to be? What kind of accountability do you have? What's the expectation of your relationship to things in the other zones? So let's start in Horizon 1. And, we mentioned we had Horizon 1A and Horizon 1B. That became slightly different. So more started to talk about the performance zone. And the performance zone most definitely was Horizon 1. This is what's our material stuff in market? Where does today's basis for existence as a company come from? But it was very much the market facing, revenue generating side of things. And then the productivity zone, also Horizon 1, was, I guess my simplification was your core functions, the things that enable your company to run in support of what's happening in the performance zone. And called it the productivity zone because really the focus there was margin and efficiency, where the focus in the performance zone was more revenue oriented. So that became our kind of Horizon 1 zones. And then, of course, we had the transformation zone, which was the Horizon 2 zone. And he took what we'd known in the past around an escape velocity. A lot of it talked about Horizon 3 investments. And then, the real gold in the book was how you moved something that worked in Horizon 3 all the way to Horizon 1 and the challenges you faced as you did so. Um, he just built on this work incredibly in the transformation zone, right? We found the next big thing. We're sure it's the next big thing. How do we turn it into the current real thing? And then the incubation zone, of course, is where do we find the next big thing? So there are a couple of extra lenses. We had these four zones. We talked about the idea of enabling investments being what sat in productivity and incubation zone, where the focus was revenue performance in the performance and the transformation zone. And we're going to deep dive into each of these zones in a minute. But the other thing that he talked about was different types of innovation, because there's a temptation to think all innovation happens in Horizon 3 in the incubation zone, and then that's completely limiting thought. So, Eric, do you want to talk a little bit more about the different types of innovations?
Yeah, I can talk briefly about that. And then I wanted to back up and talk a little bit more about the other key thing about the book that we're not really addressing in this podcast. So if you think about the four zones that Mark outlined, performance, productivity, transformation, and incubation, as being in a traditional consultant's 2x2 grid. So the performance zone and the transformation zone are all about that revenue performance. It's all about getting things to earn money. Whereas the zone one, Horizon 1 productivity zone and the Horizon 3 incubation zone, those are all about enabling investments to help you earn money more effectively now or in the future. So that's like the two rows on the grid. But if you start to think about the columns of the grid, the Horizon 1 is sustaining innovation. You're in the market, you've got to play out there, and you're going to constantly do small innovations, but you're probably not going to, say, radically change the business model of a very successful Horizon 1 business. Why would you? It's working just fine. You want to get more out of it, and you want to keep up with your competition and keep ahead of them, but it's not about disrupting with the innovation there. That's the realm of Horizon 2, the transformation zone, and frankly, everything in the incubation zone. So that's the other column. So the performance zone and the productivity zone, that's your sustaining stuff. The transformation zone and the incubation zone, that's where all the really disruptive big things happen because frankly, you're breaking your business model. You want to change your business model when you're playing on the left. You're looking for 10x improvements. You're not looking for 10% improvements. So taking the four zones, which is interesting because the four zones are almost a side effect of his real point in the book, even though it's the part that Mark and I think both really jumped on and went, wow, this is a beautiful model for organizing and making sense of the world. But he also introduces these concepts of playing offense and playing defense and then being in halftime. And think American football. It may not be everybody's metaphor that's listening, but it's the one he used. Um, Sometimes you're transforming to take a market you own and own it even more, to redefine a market that you're already a leading player in. And that's playing offense. And that's where your transformations are big and forward facing and generative on top of what you've got today. He then talks about playing defense through transformation, which is when your transformations are because your competitors are winning and you won't be able to keep up and keep competing using your existing Horizon One businesses. And you need a new way of engaging in the market and your competition. Um, and we're not going to talk a lot more about that, but I wanted to highlight that because if you're familiar with the book, if you've read through the book, you're probably thinking more a lot about offense and defense than the four zones that we are going to spend the rest of the podcast talking about. Mark, anything else you want to add to the overview before we dive in?
Yeah, I'm just going to come back out of offense and defense into disruptive and sustaining, and
Yeah.
give like a really practical example of a place I saw that at with a client. So we were looking at their innovation efforts. I was actually coaching into the Innovation Center of Excellence, which was looking to introduce new tools and techniques and build a more holistic overview of the innovation that was happening in the company. And so we went through an exercise of actually identifying every area of the company that was doing some kind of innovation oriented work, typically funded as innovation oriented work, and built this picture and said, this is everything we're doing everywhere. And then we looked through the lens of going, what type of innovation is it? And one of the lenses we took was to say, is it sustaining or disruptive? And another lens we took was to say which horizons it's sitting in. And we were really using, because we often use in horizons, we use payback periods as well. We think Horizon 3, it's 3 to 5 year before it pays out. Horizon 2, generally you're thinking kind of 18 months to 3 years. Horizon 1 is today. And what we found was that better than 80% of their innovation was sustaining innovation in Horizon 3.
Oof.
and and that built a really interesting picture and quite a provocative discussion with the CEO around starting to bring some strategy and perhaps guardrails and focus to the way that they were pursuing innovation. And whilst we were not in a zone to win implementation there, it was a pretty good example of what happens when you start to apply these classification tools to understand what's going on. Because you look at a model and say, we're doing almost no disruptive innovation, but all of our sustaining innovation sitting out in Horizon 3, it asks you a very different question about what's going on. And this is the kind of conversation that I think Zone to Win and the thinking, it starts to really provoke. But before I geek out too much further, why don't we shift over and start to talk about the performance zone?
Yeah, because I feel like we could do another 30 minutes diving into that example and the implications and the root causes. Maybe we'll do that later, but not on this arc.
Yeah.
So let's dig into performance zone. I mean, let's just restate what it is. This is your things in the market that are material to your business, and for useful discussion here, materiality is at least 10% of your revenue and probably the majority of your profits. Um, so to call yourself Horizon One, to call yourself a performance zone investment, one, you've kind of already said you're the crown jewels of the company at that point, and two, you have the income and the revenue and the bottom line to prove that you are crown jewels. All about evidence, all about being a significant, and I'm going to keep saying this, significant part of the profits and the revenue of the company. Um, and there's a lot of different ways we can talk about this zone, but as we start to think about using it in the context of um, our overall podcast arc and the implications of this zone, the thing to think about is this is both the business units you have and the channels through which you sell it. And I'm making a little cross shape, a grid shape with my hands here because that actually literally shows up in this thing he calls the performance matrix. And I think Mark and I both looked at this matrix a number of times in different ways and had different interpretations of it. And every time we would talk about it, we'd each learn something a little new about it. Um, so that in and of itself was a fascinating discussion that didn't even start with prep for this podcast. I think that started like 8 months ago. We had our first realizations that we both had wildly different preconceptions of what this thing was, and we started to really dig into it. In fact, we had a really interesting deep dive around the implication of channels and business units. And Mark, you shared a couple stories around uh, common creative tension. Let's call it that. But between businesses and channels, do you want to share a couple of those anecdotes and talk about why they're relevant and how this helps?
Yeah, look, why don't we start there? And I think I've only seen these tensions rise in recent years because, of
Hmm.
course, it's been the few years of digital transformation being the buzzword, and i- generally, it's amazingly common to see a digital organisation that is trying to drive a digital transformation of the business, and then you have your existing lines of business, business units, product organisations. And quite often we've seen product and retail channel bundled together in a line of business and then digital its own thing. And you get this amazing tension existing. Digital wants to
Hmm.
drive an agenda, the traditional BU wants to drive an agenda. Um, and they're not necessarily the same agenda, and maybe some of it's happening centrally in digital and some of it's happening out in the BU. Um, and
And
quite regularly
let's put a
separate
little
problem. Different.
well, let's put a little crunch on what that means in practice because this one hits on my summit talk from last year. And just to put a perspective for people listening, one of the most common examples of this I see is the business unit here is cool. Digital transformation, you're going to sell our stuff online now. That's great.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, digital's looking at it and says, you have some cool stuff. I'm going to change the business model through which you sell that so that we can do it in a new experience oriented, mobile first, blah, 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 pick your buzzwords way. And even that initial misconceptions about what it means to go digital
Yeah.
starts to blow up all kinds of relationships and expectations in the company. So that's an example of the kind of tensions we're talking about.
Yeah. But I think I'd actually probably take our conversation slightly differently first, right? I love the performance matrix,
Mhm.
and I read the book, and then I went, "This is a really cool thinking tool," and then I used it in anger twice, very rapidly, both with CFOs, and it was a scenario of we were heading down some portfolio paths. Of course, that starts to help you, prompt you to think a little bit differently about the way money's managed. So I got sent to talk to finance about how finance might evolve, and we wound up sitting in these really interesting exploratory sessions of going, well, let's take the idea of the performance matrix and let's build a picture of what that looks like for your organization, and see what questions it begins to ask us in terms of the way you manage and monitor your financials.
Mhm.
And I think the thing that I love most about it, straight up, goes back to the way we closed last episode. This idea of I want to have apples and apples, When I'm having a conversation, it's a strategy conversation, it's a trade-off conversation. I don't want to have a minnow next to a minotaur because the minnow is never going to feature in the conversation. So, the first piece that was really useful about the performance matrix was that he had a materiality perspective through both dimensions. Right. In order to appear on the performance matrix, the line of business, product or service, has to be 10% of your revenue. So you've got basically no more than 10 potential rows in terms of line of business. And you're going to be talking at an appropriate kind of apples and apples conversation when you think cross BU. Then he also has the same thing on the matrix in terms of channels. The channel has to be 10. And so you wind up in this thing that says, actually, I've just automatically leveled what's my layer of unfolding of the enterprise. My layer of unfolding of the enterprise is to be at the discussion table. You've got to be unfolded in such a fashion as every piece is of a similar size before we start talking.
Yeah, I love that because just to put a hard point on it, the 10% rule means that you can't get them more than an order of magnitude apart. And even at the extremes, if you've got one that's 10% and one that's 90%, they're still conversible. It's not 1%, 99%.
But the other thing that struck me, and this became one of our really interesting discussions once we started deep diving in this, was that the way Moore structures the matrix from a run, monitor, KPI set, accountability perspective is he says every cell, which is an intersection of a line of business and a channel, is actually what you strategize around and govern. And in that cell, you've got to have the row owner from the business and the column owner from the channel jointly accountable.
Yep. Both have to hit the same number there.
Yeah. And as soon as they got to hit the same number, it's going to drive a natural synergy of conversation. It's very different. It's no longer a channel strategy and a BU strategy. It's a shared strategy in the intersection. And that is incredibly powerful.
And maybe just a little foreshadowing on this because this is a portfolio arc. Do you wanna say a little bit about the implications there?
Look, I think the first implication when you begin down the portfolio arc is, we talked in the last episode around know your stakeholders. And really our conversation there was your stakeholders and the conversations and balance you want to discuss is between your BU stakeholders and your governance stakeholders. Now we're shading a little bit or nuancing what your BU stakeholders look like and go, actually, my portfolio needs to have both the line of business and the channel represented as key stakeholders and or co-owners. So that's the first piece of it. But then there's a second piece, and this was, I'm going to throw back to you in a second, Eric, because I think you were the one who crystallized this best. If you take this concept and you go, okay, I've got 10% on the rows and 10% on the columns, I've potentially got 100 cells. And, depends how I segregate my channels because I think channel is regional as well as whether you're talking digital or bricks and mortar. But 100 cells, that's a lot of portfolios in terms of a first level unfold. And so you're not naturally, when you think in terms of the portfolio implications, going, gee, there's a portfolio per cell in the matrix. Eric, why don't you take us into what happened when we started to explore that?
Well, I think we started playing Tetris is the simplest way of looking at it. I mean, you've got portfolios that enable business and or channels. And you start to look at which intersections a portfolio is actively supporting, especially for your kind of BU aligned portfolios. And we'll talk about the different types of portfolios more so in the next two episodes. But if we set aside kind of platform type portfolios for a moment, most of the rest of them hit a range of cells. And it's in service of helping this set of businesses hit their numbers through the digital channel if you had a digital portfolio, or it's in service to helping this business operationalize its things through its bricks and mortar supply chain, digital, and white labeled sales channels, for example, or regional channels, or what have you. And you can get a little flexible on the definition of channel, but you start to get some really interesting opportunities to say, well, we're not going to actually do the entire digital channel in this portfolio. We're going to do it for personal lines and business lines, but not for government, because government's a different product and we need a secure channel that has these other capabilities added. So we're going to actually put that in a different portfolio oriented different. And you start to see the coverage you have of your enterprise through the view of the materiality of what you're selling and how you're selling it. And that clarity, the ability to see these connections, I think, is going to just simplify many conversations further down where the reasons why prioritization debates are happening aren't grounded in anything. We bring it back up to the performance matrix, and it's like, okay, here's what we ground in. Are we helping move any of these three numbers or those two numbers? Yes or no? And that whole business value component of WSDA, for example, becomes a much easier conversation. But I feel like we're dwelling in performance zone because we're geeking out about ways to design suddenly portfolios. Let's not go too far down that. We've allowed ourselves to have a little bit of fun there. There's three other zones to talk about.
So,
Um,
so just closing out before we jump zones,
yeah,
I think the one thing we haven't talked about is expected KPIs, right?
mm,
Because if you know what the performance zone is and you're starting to think, well, if I figured out, I think something's in the portfolio, in the performance zone, what are the implications to me? One of those is what do I expect the KPIs and the metrics to be? And, what do we know? We expect them to be very much revenue and market share oriented.
yep.
Right?
And they're
Uh,
going to be customer facing growth metrics, pirate metrics, whatever form it takes.
yeah.
It's going to be oriented on improving the materiality, expanding your growth, or changing your ability to sell in some meaningful way.
So having taken that quick slowdown, go to the productivity zone, which many people think of as unexciting.
I don't get that.
And I know, like for a lot of years, I just wanted to be customer facing in everything I did, and perhaps it was the whole customer centricity aspect of agile. I was like, well, agile really makes sense when I'm out there customer facing, thinking about a customer experience or product offering. Um, and if I'm not customer facing, then I'm probably in trouble. And yet, productivity zone, almost by definition, doesn't tend to be customer facing.
And I know this is one of those areas where we will have some debates around. So I don't know if we want to have those now or in a little bit.
Well, I'm sure we'll bring them out a little bit. But productivity zone. So the world of enabling investment, generally the world of core shared services type operations, um, with some nuances. And I think characterized by more as the job of the productivity zone is to enable the performance zone to perform. So it's a margin orientation. It is most definitely in service of the performance zone, but it doesn't mean it's not meaningful. And Eric, why don't you take it for a minute? Because I've planted enough things. You've raised your eyebrows at that I think I've got to let you open your mouth behind the eyebrows.
Nonsense. I've got two eyes and only one mouth. That's how it works, right? I can signal a lot before I open my mouth. Or is that not how that metaphor goes? Um, but anyway, so when I look at this, the first thing is, yeah, we need to hold that productivity zone is in service to the productivity zone. It doesn't stand alone. It is not a revenue driver. It is not materially going to be a source of income for the business. Otherwise, it would be in the productivity zone as a business or as a channel. So what does that leave becomes the more interesting question. Some of them are those more shared service things in the sense of, okay, yeah, global sales organization. Let us become the best dang sales organization globally that has the best training, the best enablement, knows how to source the best sales teams, and has the greatest alliances. And there's lots of ways to amplify the impact of sales so that those sales teams can then sell against all of the channels and all of the businesses in various ways. In fact, let's even lump together and pull the whole revenue organization in there when do marketing and services right alongside. And probably your services aren't going to be material if you're in a product company. You don't want them to be overly material. Otherwise, they become a services business unit. So think implementation service, technical pre-sales, things like that. So in that environment, the productivity zones is to make those things more effective and cheaper and standardized. And I think this is where a lot of agilists start to get a little rub with productivity zone. It is the realm of standardization by definition. Um, they are shared services and they should be consistent to everybody who consumes them. You don't customize your service for every caller. Otherwise, you're just part of that organization. And that part, I think, is where people struggle with it. But all of those services are then under the control of and the responsibility of the appropriate group in the productivity zone.
In the
And
performance
then there are
zone, you
these,
mean?
I'm sorry,
In the performance zone.
and they're no, they're owned by the productivity zone. The services are.
Okay, sorry,
You're
misheard.
yeah, yeah. Now to what Mark was foreshadowing, there's also programs. There are specific enhancements that the productivity zone will do in service of specific cells or groups of cells in the performance zone. Um, we want to do a marketing campaign for these three products in this geography, and that's going to consume a big chunk of our revenue. Well, you don't just do that to a business unit. Those programs, those things that are custom and aren't shared across everything, those are under the approval and certain amount of control of the owners of the cells. And that's where it gets really interesting because it makes explicit how the productivity zone is in service to the performance zone. And I really love that nuance. And that's one of the ones that took me 3 or 4 passes, maybe even multiple reads of the book to finally realize the interplay back and forth there. This gets really interesting though for me um, when you go beyond the shared services. When we talked about sales, you could talk about HR and a variety of things. But if there's other types of shared services, if I look at an insurance company that has many lines of business, claims might actually be a shared service. And this is where the productivity zone is customer facing in a lot of companies. It is part of a whole product for a whole bunch of products. It is not just a behind the scenes thing, it is front stage if you're thinking service blueprints and visible to your customers and part of their experience and a critical component of delivering that product. And yet, it's a shared component of many products and needs to be both standardized and great for the customers. And this is where some of the really interesting, challenging bits of being a productivity zone organization start to really come into it for me. It does get exciting hiding in those cracks because how do you create a claims process that's a positive experience in the first place? I mean, if you're US insurance organizations, um, and consistent and a healthy experience for every single user, regardless of which line of insurance they've purchased. And that's where I think we start to see the productivity zones start to have meaningful strategies in a few different ways.
I, I'm going to argue that the productivity zone has to have strategies every which way but loose,
True, true.
right?
I don't think there's much of an argument there.
It was, and for me, I think the thing that really resonated in the productivity zone, in Zone to Win, was that notion of you've still got a customer,
Hmm.
right? It just so happens your customer's in the performance zone. And I mentally translate to starting to think, well, actually, that puts me in a B2B2C model,
Yeah.
right? I'm serving a customer who's serving an organization's customer. And any good B2B2C model doesn't just focus on understanding the B2B part. They've got to
Hmm.
understand the customers that they're B2B partners are servicing. And in actual fact, quite often their responsibility is to educate the intermediate on new possibilities that they can leverage with those customers. One of my clients is B2B2C, selling to OEMs, quite large brand name
Yep.
OEMs, with some quite disruptive products from an innovation perspective. And they find product market fit for their ideas with the real customers. And then they go and take that proof point back to their OEM customers. And they use that to generate the design wins and to actually get the incorporations. And I think the same thing holds true when you think, what's my lens in the productivity zone? My lens is I've got customers. That's the performance zone. I've got to understand their customers. And sometimes I'm showing the potential that I know about that they didn't. And
Mhm.
sometimes just going, I'm trying to understand what they're doing with their customers so I can understand what I can do for them. And then there becomes an implication financially, which is that it starts to take us into thinking about a basically cost to serve model. And it's one of the places, and I'm going to avoid getting into a very deep rabbit hole. It's
Please.
one of the places that I love TBM, or technology business management, because I think often the things that we think of in the productivity zone are conceived of as BAU, and BAU funding. Most companies I've worked with, BAU funding is what was your money last year, and we're going to give you a plus or minus based on our productivity targets, CPI, and it's almost like an invisible black hole, because it's just a lump sum of money that pays for BAU, as opposed to going, can we understand in a way where we understand the total cost of ownership, where we can think about the cost to serve, and start to relate the cost to serve in the productivity zone back to its component of the cost to serve in the performance zone, and really shifting your financial focus away from I provide a service which you buy as an entire service for a year into I provide a service that you can understand the way that it impacts the underlying costs in your service to your end customers.
And the B2B to C, business to business to consumer lens is an interesting one because I think a lot of people see that as I'm behind the scenes, therefore I'm in service to that business, which is in service to the customer. And one of the lenses that I've found really helps leaders reimagine their role and become much better partners as a result is to, I'm a math geek, so put some parentheses in there and think of it as I'm a business in service to the relationship between the business and the customer.
Well, that's a nice
So
framing,
you're
Eric.
so you're not just looking at the direct relationship, you're in service to amplifying that other relationship through all the tools at your disposal, but you can't do that in a way that doesn't bring your business along, the middle B along, the your partner along. So you're still in service organizationally to that external unit, but your mission is centered around amplifying the relationship between the enterprise and the customer still.
So, having avoided a couple of very deep rabbit holes,
There's at least 2 1-hour pits we jumped over there.
why don't we move on and chat a bit about incubation? And I guess I'm going to kick us off here to go. It's very easy to confuse the incubation zone with innovation. And I think it's where I love the fact that Moore points out sustaining innovation, disruptive innovation, innovation's happening everywhere. Um, and my intro to the incubation zone was I start off going, well, that's just Horizon 3. And then Moore points out that actually you've got to get a proof point with your early innovation efforts to gain entry to the incubation zone,
Mhm.
right? It's not here is where all experimentation starts. It's you're going to run experiments, and some of those experiments are going to generate enough proof in their early, let's say, lean startup cycles to go, this could become material, and gives them entry to the incubation zone. And Eric, why don't I throw to you? I know you geeked out hard on the materiality perspective of it.
Oh, it's fascinating to me there because I had never caught that nuance either. That things in the incubation zone are already operating businesses. In fact, his recommended model is it's a mini company inside a portfolio, almost and explicitly treated as a venture capital portfolio within the company. And when I started to run that down, the place where people go to play with cool ideas, that's not what this is. These are things that are material in the context of the incubation zone. So if the materiality for a performance zone investment is 10% of your revenue, your $1 billion company, you have to earn $100 million to get in there. To be an incubation zone, you still have to have some revenue, but it's like 1%. It's like, yeah, we're somewhere in that journey from a couple $1 million a year to $10 million a year within that $1 billion company. That's a real business, and it needs a real team to run it. But what we don't know yet, and this is the important part, is we don't know if it's going to be disruptive or if it's going to be an interesting thing that we decide not to run with long term. And we might spin it off, sell it, um, pop it out into a fully owned subsidiary that we don't really pay attention to or whatever. And those are all viable exits, unless we discover that one of those has the potential to be material to our main business. And so you're living in this little VC like portfolio with a goal of earning enough to see if you can make that jump from, say, 5 million to potentially hitting 100 million. If you can, then you're a candidate to go through the transformation zone and go through Horizon 2. If you can't, cool. We learned a lot. We might reabsorb it into another one of the operating businesses. We might spin it out. There's lots of different things that can happen, but it's not going to be the next big thing. And there's an interesting side note there that I hadn't picked up until I read this one around. That's true of productivity zone things as well. And you can have things in your incubation zone that have the potential to move a key business metric by 10x. And that becomes very significant productivity zone type things. And that one had completely escaped me, but um, there's some big stuff hiding in there as well. But I think the big takeaway I had on all of this is where things go when your engineers find them during hackathons and start to play with them as side projects down in the portfolio. And it's like, oh, we might have something real here. And now you have a place for that. This might be real to go, because otherwise it just gets overwhelmed with the weight of business. It's like, yeah, cool. You're going to earn us a couple $1 million next year. We're $100 million business. Why are you bothering? Or we're a $500 million business. Why are you bothering? There's a level at which it's immaterial to the senior leaders and you won't get attention. So we need a place for it to go. And that's where the incubation zone really shines.
I think one of the things that really struck me about his thinking in the incubation zone was the end of life. So you've earned the right to be in the incubation zone. Because you're in the incubation zone, you're living in a world of very different discussions, very different finance models, as Eric mentioned, VC style finance typically. Your metrics and KPIs are going to be different because their nature is going to be more oriented towards proof of growth potential and less to profit margin, typically. But, and Eric's already touched on this, there's kind of three ways out of the incubation zone. There's the way out that says, we've got proof, take us into the transformation zone and scale us. There's the way out that says, it's never going to be material, divest, right? Spin it off as a separate subsidiary, sell it to somebody. There's a way out which is attach yourself to something in the performance zone, right? You're not going to scale. We don't think it's an appropriate divestment, but you have a right to live if you can find somebody in the performance zone who wants to take you under their umbrella.
Yep.
Or, you know what, we're just going to kill it, right? There's most definitely kind of a life cycle in the incubation zone. You don't live there forever. You gain entry, you have a period of time, and then the test and the evaluation in there is to say, well, what's your potential eventual home?
Yes.
But having said that, why don't we talk about transformation? And it's an interesting thing that I guess came out as a thread as we deep dived the many rambles we had before we actually started recording properly, which is most of my life in, I guess, the scaled agility world has not been working on huge, disruptive, transformative things. It- It's been on really productivity zone oriented work, or productivity and performance zone, Horizon 1.
Yep.
And Eric gets very excited about Horizon 2 and transformation as a vehicle for many opportunities, not just product. So excited, in fact, that he's writing a book about it. So I'm going to throw to Eric and let you hear from the wisdom of the many thousands of hours he spent thinking about it.
Oh, so you're asking me to convey several thousand hours of thinking in 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Perfect.
It's
Sounds like many conference talks. Um, no, it's interesting though. Looking at transformation zone. Let's be clear. There's a singular goal of a small business entering the transformation zone. You're coming out of incubation. Your incubation material. You're 1% of revenue, and you've got 12 to 18 months to get to 10%. You want to become a row in that matrix we talked about under the performance zone. So fundamentally, you need to take the growing up business to move from 1% to 10% and to become a meaningful, ongoing concern at the scale you are relevant in your business. And I remember sitting next to one of the, I think it was a group program manager title or something like that at Microsoft at a conference. Very senior guy in the Visual Studio business unit. And he's like, there are so many good ideas bubbling up. And most of these small businesses we look at, we've already had that idea and chosen not to pursue it. Because in order to be considered material, and this is the first time I really started to think about materiality like 10 years ago or something like that, to become material within even just the Visual Studio group, we have to be a more than $1 billion business in the first year. And then I look at all the other little product companies that I was thinking of as like, why don't you do this and why don't you do this? And they're all like $100 million companies. They're $10 million companies. Okay, that makes sense. Even at Microsoft scale, that's not even important enough to bother with. Um, and that important enough to bother with is the trigger. If you can't see a path to being that important, then you shouldn't go into the transformation zone because you're putting a lot of weight and a lot of energy behind it at a company level. Now, what I've discovered is when you do see that path, it gets really exciting for everybody. You've got the CEO's interest, you've got the entire executive team's awareness, you've got a little bit of envy and a heck of a lot of awareness from the other business units and maybe some political jockeying. You've got probably employees across the company lined up raising their hands wanting to be a part of it. You've got a ton of energy, and that opens the change box. You basically get a chance to rewrite a whole bunch of rules, not just create a new business, not just amplify sales and ramp up the traditional model. You're probably something that looks significantly like a new business model for the company. You're going to need new significant capabilities. You're going to bring in new technologies. And suddenly you have an opportunity not just to improve a new business unit, but to really pull together new human capabilities and bring staff to operating in a different way and help the company learn a significant new skill set or approach or way of agility, perhaps even that you haven't had elsewhere in the company. You've got the energy and the impetus to push through the challenges of new security models and new technology stacks and these things that would be 4 or 5 year discussions if you tried to do them in the existing businesses can actually just become part of what you're doing. And they're like maybe not made decisions. You need to actually put some energy and some thought into it. But the many of the roadblocks to change go away when you're in the transformation zone. And I think a lot of companies, and this is the exciting part of the book for me, is a lot of companies are leaving those other opportunities on the table when they aren't actually extra whip. They actually speed up your journey through the transformation zone because people are leaning into them. It's the time when change is actually easy, unlike all the other times as coaches when change feels like you're pushing boulders uphill. So I get really excited when I see that. I've had the opportunity to be in or alongside that in 3 or 4 cases now in different roles. And when it happens, it's pretty powerful because you just feel like everybody's coming together, and it's that finally that visionary moment of change that I think a lot of agile coaches are like, we want to be a part of this. And portfolio managers are like, that sounds scary and disruptive, but it's kind of cool. Which is why you don't put it in the middle of everything else. It does need its own space. Is that what you were hoping I would say, Mark?
You did it in 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Um,
I'm impressed with myself.
I, I'm going to add a couple of words, and one of those is a confession. When I read Escape Velocity and read the Horizon 2 concept before he had it formalized in the transformation zone, the first thing I did was to go, what happens if I apply horizon-based thinking to agile transformation?
I think we all did that. Yep.
Right. And wrote a couple of blog posts. What does it look like? And it was quite an interesting thinking exercise. But, agile transformations become not a preferred way of thinking about it for many very good reasons. What I love about your take on this, Eric, and the first time you got excited and geeked out on it, shared it with me, was, it resonates to me. You should never be chasing agile for agile's sake or lean for lean's sake. Right? If you're doing something transformative, it should be transforming your business model. And recognizing the transformation zone is, making a material change to potentially a multi-billion dollar organization and going, you know what? If so much else is going to change, we'll stitch some ways of working, thinking into it as an enabler of it, but not as the reason for it.
Yep.
The other thing I particularly loved in the zone concept of transformation zone was more stress. Only one thing can be in the transformation zone, right? And, I think there's a whole episode on digging into zone defense versus offense in the transformation zone and what happens to the incubation zone when you enter something in the transformation zone. But he really stresses his point. If it's going to be that potentially big, there can be only one thing, and it's got to be directly under the purview of the CEO.
Yep.
And having worked with a couple of clients over the years who had multiple multi-billion dollar transformations running simultaneously, and dealing with the implications of those things. And I just watched your eyebrows, and yes, that was the implications.
And chaos.
It really is. It's a beautiful focusing tool. So I was about to head into a wrap up, but I'm sensing you had one more thing you wanted to say in transformation before I wrapped us.
Yeah, just a riff on what you were saying, because that agile transformation as a Horizon 2 activity, as a transformation zone thing at a company level. Um, if I put on my company leadership hat for a second, and I ask, let's pretend you're an agile coach or consultant, which isn't really a stretch because you are. And I say, but you're working for me. It's like, cool. You want this transformation, this agile transformation, to be the company number one. Let me ask you: are you willing to commit to a 10x improvement on a key metric around our cost of technology? And that puts a lens on it that I think is quite valuable. If you see a 10x improvement opportunity, let's say a 5x reduction in cost and a 2x improvement of cost and delay by virtue of going faster, then maybe it could be. But we got to commit, and you got 18 months, and your job depends on it.
I'm going to give you my 20-second response to that, and then I'm going to wrap the show up because we are over time.
Yep.
My 20-second response is, I would say it's got a legitimate potential if you think of it as a zone defense play. Because when the day comes, we actually unpack it. More suggestion, and I see this turned up very clearly in your strategy, and it's a strategy as well, was if you're coming from behind, you often need to run a productivity waste elimination exercise in the transformation zone to give yourself the space to do the true forward movement transformation zone. And I reckon there's an interesting argument around major agile / lean focus as a defensive strategy in the transformation zone to make way for an offense.
Yeah, that's going to be a type of agility that most coaches won't enjoy, though.
Yeah,
So
true.
I think we should do it. Let's do a conversation on that in the future. Let's wrap this one for now.
All right, so wrapping this one up. This was the beginning to completely geek out on strategy episode. We started with the idea your strategy needs to unfold you should be able to take an overall enterprise strategy and see some logical pieces of it and understand that they add back up to the whole and where their neighbors are and perhaps the purpose of each piece and its relationship to its neighbors. And, acknowledge the fact that that's quite possibly not the way your current strategies or portfolios unpack. Uh, but, part of doing that is to say, what are some lenses by which we can evaluate the way it's currently unpacked and understand and start to categorize maybe the purpose of the pieces, which is where we started to love the thinking of horizon-based investment and zone to win. Because there's a beginning point where you might be able to say the first layer of unpack is to say there's 4 pieces of the strategy: performance, productivity, transformation, and incubation. And transformation may or may not be present depending on whether we've got something that's been brave enough to enter the transformation zone. And we'll see in the next episode what happens when you start to say, well, let's go another layer of granularity, but leverage the thinking of the zones as we get down to something a little bit more concrete in terms of different types of portfolio and their elements of strategy. So that is a wrap, and we'll see you back for episode 4, where we will start to talk about different types of portfolios. Until then.